Welcome. Today, I'm going to talk about the idea is, does the just war theory apply in Islam? I'm Dr. Roger Cohen, delivering to you this lecture in February 2026. So today we will look at an extended amount of time into one of the most complex and misunderstood and urgently relevant bodies of thought in the history of the world, Islamic tradition of just war. So, does theology, jurisprudence, and the ethics of warfare apply to Islamic ethics? I chose those three words deliberately, theology, because the question of war is when permissible is never just a political question in Islam. It always bound up with the nature of God, the obligation God imposes on human beings, and the ultimate purposes for each human life exist is bound in this. Jurisprudence, the second word, because Islamic civilization produced a remarkable legal tradition that tried over centuries to turn those theological commitments into actual rules. And ethics, because what makes this tradition worth studying is precisely that it never stopped asking whether what was being done was right. A word about what this lecture is not a lecture about terrorism. It's not a lecture designed to defend or condemn any particular political movement. It's a lecture about ideas, rich, contested, historically embedded ideas that Muslim scholars have debated well over 1,200 years. I want you to leave today understanding the genuine depth of that intellectual tradition and understanding why it is both too complex to reduce to a soundbite and too important to ignore. So, with this, let's begin. We have an overview for today, our discussion. This is our roadmap for today. Our roadmap for this lecture has 8 major themes, each of which could fill an entire seminar all on its own. We will move through them in sequence, but I want you to hold in mind from the very beginning that these are not neatly separate topics. They bleed into one another, they argue with each other, and they evolved in response to each other. We begin with the conceptual foundations, the basic vocabulary we need before anything else makes sense. Then move into classical jurisprudence, the legal tradition that emerged in the 8th and ninth centuries and attempted to derive binding rules from scripture and prophetic example. We'll look within that classical tradition. We'll pay special attention to the Shia perspective, which developed its own distinctive approach grounded in the theology of Imamate. We will then look at two Sunni thinkers who pushed in a more activist direction, Ibn Askar and Ibn Taymiya, before turning to the very different worlds of Sufi mysticism and Aristotle philosophy, both of which offered alternate ways of thinking about war and its justification. We're going to look at the Quran itself, what it says about war, why it says it such apparently conduct in contradictory ways, and we'll consider how the Crusades from the Christian movement shaped Islamic thinking and practice. Finally, we'll arrive in the modern period where the tradition fractured and reconfigured under the pressure of colonialism, nationalism, and political crisis. So there's 8 stops on a 1,200-year journey. Let's begin and enjoy the ride. The very first um, place we'll begin is before we can understand anything about Islamic just war thought, we need to understand the word that sits just at its center, jihad. And when we need to understand it on its own terms, not through the distorting lens of contemporary political controversy. The Arabic root of jihad means effort, striving, or exertion. In Qur'anic Arabic, it carries the sense of pushing to one's limit for the sake of God. That is why, from the very beginning, Muslim scholars recognized that jihad was a term of wide application. Yes, it could describe military effort in the defense of a Muslim country, but it could equally describe the effort to study, the effort of study, the effort of giving to the poor, the effort of restraining one's own worst impulses. The concept was elastic in a way that made it both powerful and persistently contested. The second concept on the slide is the classical division of the world into what jurists called Dar al-Islam, literally abode of Islam, the territory where Muslim governance prevailed and Islamic law was practiced, and the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, the territories outside of that governance. Now, I want to be careful here. Some Western scholars have argued that this division implies Islam is inherently and permanently at war with the non-Muslim world. It's too simple. What the division describes is a theoretical framework, not a standing declaration of war, not a standard operating procedure. Many jurists have recognized intermediate categories like the abode of treaty, the abode of truce, that acknowledge the practical necessity of peaceful coexistence with non-Muslim polities. And as we will see, the question of when actual warfare was permissible was governed by a complex set of conditions that most Muslim scholars took very, very seriously. The third concept is dawah, the summons or invitation. This was one of the most important just war principles in classical Islamic thought and is one of the least well known outside the specialist circles. The overwhelming majority of classical jurists held that before any military action can be considered just, the Muslim community was obligated to extend an invitation to the enemy, an offer to accept Islam, or, for those who refused, to accept the protected status of living under Islamic governance, with their lives and property secured in exchange for attacks. Only after this invitation had been refused could warfare be legitimately initiated. So think about what this principle implies. It means that war in classical Islamic thought was not merely a response to attack. It preceded by a diplomatic and religious overture. It was embedded in a framework of communication. It was constrained by the obligation not to destroy what could be converted or incorporated. This is a long way from the image of Islamic conquest as pure religious fanaticism. It was legally constructed enterprise with defined preconditions, even if, as we see, the preconditions were contested and sometimes honored in the breach. We move now into the first great body of systematic thinking about just war in Islam, classical jurisprudence. This is the legal tradition that emerged in the generation or two after the Prophet Muhammad, as the Muslim community found itself governing a vast and rapidly expanding empire and needed answers to urgent practical questions. How should Muslim armies conduct themselves in war? What protections do non-combatants receive? What happens to prisoners? When can you trust a truce? These were not abstract philosophical questions. They were questions with life and death implications, and the jurists who answered them were operating in the context of real political power. The three thinkers we will focus on in this section, Abu Yusuf, Ash-Shaybani, and Ibn Rushd, represent three distinct moments and approaches within classical tradition. So let's take a look. Abu Yusuf died in 798 of the Common Era CE in the Golden Age, the Abbasid Caliphate, when Baghdad was arguably the most intellectually sophisticated city on earth. He was the chief judge, the Qadi, the appointed of the famous Caliph Harun Rashid, and he was a student of the great Abu Hanif, founder of the Hanafi school of law. His most important work for our purposes of the trees was called Kitab al-Kharaj, the Book of Land Tax. Now, the title sounds like an accounting manual, not a contribution to just war theory, but the practical questions of empirical governance always bled into the deeper legal and ethical questions. And in this text, Abu Yusuf found himself addressing the fundamental question of when and how Muslim rulers could act legitimately and wage war. His answer centered on Dawa, the prior summons. He was asked by Rashid whether Muslims' armies were obligated to offer the invitation to Islam before attacking polytheists. His answer was ambiguously yes. Unambiguously, yes. This was not optional piety, it was a legal prerequisite for just warfare. The enemy had to be given a chance to enter Islam or to accept dhimmi status, protected status, before swords could be drawn. What is remarkable about this position is how much it constrains the caliph's freedom of action. Even the most powerful Muslim ruler in the world, in Abu Yusuf's view, did not have unlimited license to make war. He was bound by law. His colleague, Muhammad ibn Hassan Ash-Shaybani, pushed the legal tradition further still. Ash-Shaybani wrote what is known as the Siyar al-Kabir, the Great Book of Conduct, which sometimes describes the first systematic treatment of what we today call international humanitarian law. Think about that for a minute. 8 centuries before Hugo Grotius wrote 12 centuries before the Geneva Conventions, a Muslim jurist in Baghdad was attempting to codify the rules governing the treatment of prisoners, the protection of non-combatants, the limits of permissible weapons, and the conduct of sieges. His non-combatant protections are particularly striking. Women, children, the elderly, monks, peasants who did not take part in fighting. All those categories were, in Ash-Shaybani's view, beyond the reach of legitimate military violence. This is not a marginal or disputed position. It reflected the broad consensus of the Afghani school and indeed classical Islamic jurisprudence more generally. The principle of discrimination between combatants and non-combatants, which Western just war theory identifies as one of its core in bello requirements, was already present and developed in Islamic legal thought by the beginning of the ninth century. I want you to hold those thoughts as we proceed because it becomes important when we reach the modern period and ask, what happened to this careful, rule-bound tradition? Our next figure in Western traditions is Averroes, and he occupies a peculiar position in intellectual history. For medieval European philosophers, he was the first and foremost the commentator, the great interpreter of Aristotle's, who, whose work was indispensable for the development of scholastic thought, including Aquinas. For Muslim philosophers and jurists, he was the last great systematic thinker of the Andalusian tradition, writing in Moorish Spain in the late 12th century as the Christian reconquest was pressing southward. His contribution to just war theory comes primarily from legal compendium, the Bidayat al-Mujtahid, which might be translated as the beginning of the one who exercises independent legal judgment. It is a work of comparative jurisprudence. Rashid surveys the disagreements among the legal schools and identifies underlying principles at issue and evaluates the evidence. It is, in this method, one of the most intellectually sophisticated works of medieval jurisprudence. One of the prior summons questions, Ibn Rushd comes down firmly with the majority. Enemies must be invited to Islam or protected status before warfare can begin. He notes that this applies especially to polytheists. According to the Quran, commands believers to fight until all religion belongs to God, and he immediately complicates this. Certain peoples, traditionally the Ethiopians and the Turks, were established practice exempted from active jihad. Well, why? The reasons were disputed, and Rashid is honest about the dispute. What matters is that the universal command to fight was subject to recognized exemptions, which tells us even the most expansive interpretation of offensive jihad operated within a framework of rules and distinctions. So the question from Islamic just war theory becomes this. The question is there a license to kill enemy fighters based on their unbelief? That is, on the simple fact that they have not accepted Islam, or is this based on their capacity and willingness to fight? This is not merely a technical question. Its answer determines whether non-fighting unbelievers, women gathering water, farmers plowing fields, old men in their homes, monks at prayer can legitimately be killed in warfare. If killing is licensed by unbelief, then the principle anyone who has not accepted Islam is a legitimate target. If killing is licensed only by the capacity to fight, then all those who do not or cannot fight are protected. This full spectrum of scholarly opinion, and Rashid finds genuine, serious disagreement, and he concludes the majority view restricts killing to those who actually fight. Non-combatants are protected. This is a great development within intellectual thought. So far, everything we have discussed has come from the Sunni tradition, but Islamic civilization is not a monolithic, and Shia tradition developed its own distinctive and theologically original approach to just war, one that is grounded in a concept with no real parallel in Sunni thought, the theology of the imamate. For Shia Muslims, the community after the Prophet was led by a series of divinely appointed imams, descended from the Prophet through his son-in-law and cousin Ali ibn Abi Talib. These imams were not merely political leaders or qualified jurists, they were understood to possess a unique inherited spiritual and legal authority that could not be delegated or reproduced through ordinary channels of scholarship. They were, in a theological sense, the custodians of the true meaning of the revelation. Al-Kulani, who died in 941 CE, was a great compiler of Shia Hadith tradition that collected reports of the imams said and did. Among those reports, he preserved traditions attributed to the fifth Imam, al-Bakir, to the effect that God had imposed jihad as a duty, but had attached the duty specifically to the Imam. It was the Imam who had authority and the knowledge to declare offensive jihad. Without an Imam who could properly authorize and lead it, offensive warfare was not a legitimate religious obligation. It was only a political act, unsanctioned by divine authority. Now, here's where this becomes historically monumentous. According to Shia doctrine, the 12th Imam Muhammad al-Mahdi entered a state of occultation occultation in 874. He did not die. He was hidden from the world and returned at the end of times to establish justice. So, in the meantime, the committee had no imam physically present to authorize an offensive jihad. The logistical conclusion drawn by Shia jurists and articulated with great clarity by the Al-Tusi in the 11th century was that offensive jihad was in principle suspended during the period of the imam's occultation. Think about the political implications of this doctrine. It meant that any Shia ruler who wished to pursue aggressive military expansion faced a genuine theological obstacle. The most fundamental act of religious warfare required an authority that was, by definition, not available. This created a strong structural brake on the velocity of the Shia political thought. It did not eliminate warfare. The offensive war was still immediately obligatory, and the line between offensive and defenses could be argued over, but introduced a presumption against aggressive war that no precise Sunni equivalent. It is worth comparing the Sunni tradition. In Sunni jurisprudence, the obligation to pursue offensive jihad was a collective obligation that fell on the community and its qualified rules and rulers. There was no equivalent requirement for unequivocally unauthoritative figures. The absence of the imam created no equivalent theological paralysis. A difference rooted in a deep theological disagreement about the nature of legitimate authority produced two just war traditions while sharing common Qur'anic foundations, and they arrived at meaningfully different conclusions about their warfare. Now we move on to two figures whose contributions to Islamic just war thought have enormous and sometimes troubling historical consequences. Ibn Askir and Ibn Taymiya. Ibn Askir was a scholar of Damascus who lived and wrote during the crusading period when Muslim territories, the Levant, were under sustained military pressure from Christian armies. His context was urgency. Muslim community was losing ground. Rulers were preoccupied with internal politics. Ordinary Muslims seemed, to his eyes, to be disengaged from the defense of their faith and their lands. His response was to articulate a doctrine of religious obligation. That participation in jihad was not merely something you did if the Sultan commanded it, or if you happened to live near a battlefield. It was a matter of personal religious character. A Muslim who fought jihad needed to be a person of genuine faith and dissent of religious conduct, not merely a soldier obeying orders. This move internalizes the requirement for jihad in a way that elevates its spiritual stakes, but it also begins to shift the focus of authority, the locus of authority. If jihad is fundamentally a matter of personal faith and obligation, then who has the authority to call it or restrain it? Even Taymiya took that question and pushed it to its logical and, many would argue, dangerous conclusion. He wrote in the early 14th century during the Mongol invasions that devastated much of the Islamic world. He faced a situation without clear precedent. Mongol rulers who had formally converted to Islam but continued to govern by traditional Mongol customary law rather than Sharia law. Were the rulers truly Muslim? Were Muslims obligated to obey them? Were Muslim soldiers obligated to fight for them? Even Tamaya's answer was electrifying and radical. He issued legal opinions, fatwas, declaring that the Mughal rulers were apostates and hypocrites, and that warfare against them was not merely permitted, but obligatory. He went further. He argued the defense of jihad, the jihad of the Muslim community, responding to attack was individual obligation that fell on every capable Muslim personally. It did not require a ruler's declaration. It did not require a properly constituted authority to call it. When the community was attacked, the obligation was to defend it, immediate, personal, and non-delegable. The doctrine of individual offensive obligation is one of the most consequential ideas of history of Islamic political thought because it provided a theological template for armed resistance movements that operate outside the framework of established states, movements that could claim they were fulfilling individual religious obligations regardless of what the ruler had said. It has been invoked repeatedly in modern groups by attacking and seeking to justify warfare that lacked recognized state authoritarian grounds. Then we turn to Sufism. I want to pause here, step back in the from the juridical tradition for a moment, because two other intellectual currents in Islam civilization developed from their own accounts of jihad that are profoundly important. Both of them push against the tendency to reduce the concept to military dimension. First is Sufism, the mystical tradition within Islam. Sufi thinkers drew on the hadith attributed, though with disputed chains of transmission, the Prophet himself. Returning from military campaign, the Prophet reportedly said to his companions, "We have returned from the lesser jihad to the greater jihad." And what they meant when they asked what he meant by what was a greater jihad, he replied, the struggle against the nafs, against the self. Now, the historical authenticity of the Hadith has been debated by scholars. Some Sunni traditionalists regard it as weak, but its influence on Islamic spiritual culture has been immense, regardless of its precise historical provenance, because it gave expression to something that was resonated deeply in the mystical tradition. The idea that the fundamental warfare of human existence is interior within you. The nafs, or the lower self, is understood in Sufi thought as the seat of the ego, that of pride, of lust, the attachment to worldly things that prevents the soul from turning fully towards God. Conquering the nafs required sustained discipline effort, the cultivation of patience, gratitude, trust in God, love without attachment to outcomes. This is the greater jihad, a lifelong campaign against one's own impulses. The military implications of this perspective are significant. If the greater jihad is interior, then the warrior who gives to battle without having first subdued his own ego is, in the Sufi view, fighting the lesser war while losing the greater one. He may be killing external enemies in the name of God, while his heart is governed by pride, anger, or desire for glory. Such a jihad, however, over outwardly correctest conditions, is spiritually corrupted. This created a powerful counterweight to bellicose interpretations of Islamic obligation. The Sufi tradition spread through much of the Islamic world, South Asia, West Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, often the primary vehicle of Islamic teachings and regions that where formal legal scholarship was scarce. In these contexts, the interior understanding of jihad was frequently the dominant one. So let's look at philosophical traditions that represented here by Al-Farabi. Al-Farabi was the 10th century's greatest Islamic philosopher, deeply immersed in Greek thought, particularly Plato and Aristotle. His political philosophy centered on what he called the virtuous city, a polity organized around the pursuit of true happiness and human excellence, led by the philosopher ruler. In this framework, war appears to be an instrument of political order. Al-Farabi's claim is striking. Sometimes human beings and human communities cannot be brought to their proper flourishing by persuasion alone. Their communities so inhabited to vice, so structured around wrong orders of values that they cannot be redirected by force. War, for Al-Farabi, can be the political physician's last resort, the tool that corrects by compulsion what cannot be corrected in argument. But notice the condition he reaches. War must be authorized and led by someone who possesses both professional military competence and rational and moral virtues appropriate to that genuine leader. A war by vicarious, incompetent, or self-serving rulers cannot be just unless the ostensible goal is good. The character of the leadership constitutes the justice of the enterprise. So we have been talking about how Muslim scholars interpreted and applied a just war theory principles. Now let's get back to the primary source, the Quran itself, and ask what it actually says about war, because the answer turns out to be more complicated than most people on the other side of contemporary debates about Islam tend to acknowledge. There are two columns on the slide, one on the left, what I call the bellicose passages, on the right, we call restrictive passages. These are not cherry-picked by partisans of one view or another. They are all there in the same text, and in any honest engagement with Quran on the question of war has to deal with both sides of the ledger. So on the left, the Quran does repeatedly exhort believers to fight in God's way and does promise great rewards to those who do so. Surah 3, Ayah 169 to 179, Surah 9, Ayah 111. These are all other and many other passages celebrate the fighter who risks his life for God's cause. The so-called sword verse, Surah 9, Ayah 5, command the believers to fight polytheists wherever they are found. And Surah 9, Ayah 29, command fighting the book of the people, Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, the protective tax. These are ambiguous commands. They cannot be explained away. Look at the other column, Surah 2, Ayah 190, explicitly prohibits aggression. God does not love aggressors. Surah 8, Ayah 61 commands that if the enemy inclines towards peace, Muslims must respond in kind. Surah 5, Ayah 34, which is borrowed from modification from Jewish Talmud, declares that whoever kills one innocent soul is as if he has killed all of humanity. And these passages are equally unambiguous. And they establish a presumption against violence and a deep concern for the preservation of innocent life. So what do we do with this apparent contradiction? This is the central methodological challenge for classical Islamic jurisprudence, and it produced one of the most important debates in the entire tradition, the question of abrogation. The doctrine of abrogation holds that later Quranic revelations can supersede earlier ones. That when God revealed something new that was incompatible with something done earlier, and the earlier revelation was canceled or abrogated. Applied to war passages, the abrogation argument goes like this. The peaceful verses were revealed early in the Prophet's career, when the Muslim community was small and vulnerable and needed to practice restraint. As the community grew stronger, the later revelations came, including the sword verses. These later, more aggressive commands abrogated the earlier ones, peaceful ones. If you accept this argument, you arrive at a relatively expansive view of jihad. The obligation to fight is wide, limited mainly by practical capacity. If you reject it, if you argue that the sword versus specified particular historical circumstances rather than establishing universal commands, or that all Quranic passages must be read in harmony with the hierarchy, you're at a much more restrictive view of warfare that is permissible. The debate was not resolved in the classical period and has not been resolved since. Both positions have serious scholarly defenders. What matters for our purpose in recognizing is that the Quranic text is genuinely ambiguous and that the diversity of Islamic just war thought is not arbitrary or responsible. It is the product of genuine, sustained effort to make coherent sense of this complex scripture. This turns us now to the Crusades and historical formation. We move from the text to history, from the question of what Islamic law said about war in the abstract to the question of how real political experience shaped and redefined the theory. The Crusades are an obvious reference point. From 1096 CE, the Pope Urban II's call to arms sent thousands of European knights and pilgrims eastward and continuing in the various forms for nearly 2 centuries. The Crusades represent the most sustained and violent encounter between Islamic and Christian military cultures in the medieval period. Muslim rulers, jurists, and ordinary people had to grapple with a new kind of enemy, organized, motivated by religious conviction, and capable of holding territory, and in many cases willing to negotiate. The First Crusade was a catastrophe for the Muslim world. Jerusalem fell in 1099, and the Crusaders' conduct, massacring the city's Muslims and Jewish inhabitants, sent shockwaves throughout the Islamic world. But the response was slow and politically fragmented. The Muslim political landscape of the late 11th century was divided between the declining Abbasid Caliphate and the Turks, the Shia Caliphate in Egypt, and a dozen other smaller principalities, none of which had the unified authority to organize a comprehensive counterattack. Over the next century, figures like Zengi, Nur al-Din, and ultimately Saladin gradually consolidated Muslim power and began recovering lost territory. Saladin's recapture of Jerusalem in 1187 was the event that triggered the Third Crusade, but I want to focus on something that tends to be get less attention than the military campaigns, the practice of diplomacy and truce. Muslim rulers and crusade states were not simply locked in permanent warfare. They negotiated, they made treaties, they traded, they sometimes operated against common enemies. And this created an urgent jurisprudential question. How should Islamic law elevate agreements and permanent enemies? When is it permissible to make peace, even temporary peace, with people who occupy land you believe belong to Muslim communities? The classical tradition resources were critical and crucial. The Prophet himself set a precedent with a treaty of Hudaybiyah in 628, a 10-year truce with the Meccans that seemed humiliating at the time but proved strategically valuable. The Quran explicitly allowed treaties with non-Muslims when they kept their obligations. Islamic jurists generally concluded that truces were permissible when the interests of the Muslim community required them, subject to the condition that the terms not be dishonorable. The crusading experience had more troubling effect. It intensified the discourse of individual obligations. The defense of Muslims was not something that you could leave to someone else. If your rulers were paralyzed by politics or complacency, you still had a personal obligation. So this turns us to modern views of just war. We arrive at the part of the story that's most immediately relevant to the contemporary world, and also the part where the intellectual stakes are the highest, because what happened to the Islamic just war thought in the 20th century was not simply a continuation or gradual evolution of the classical tradition. In important ways, it's a rupture. To understand that rupture, you need to understand the context that produced it, European colonialism. By the 20th century, nearly the entire Muslim world was either directly colonized by European powers or living under their indirect economic and political control. Britain, France, Netherlands, Russia, between them, they governed the vast majority of the world's Muslim population. The Ottoman Empire, the last great Muslim political power, dissolved at the end of the First World War. The Caliphate, the institutional symbol of Muslim political unity, was abolished by Ataturk in 1924. For Muslim intellectuals of the 20th century, this was not merely a political defeat, it was a theological challenge of the first order. If Islam was the final and perfect guidance for human civilization, why were Muslim societies subjugated, poor, politically defragmented? What was going wrong? And more urgently, what is needed to change? The thinkers we're about to meet all gave different answers to these questions, but they shared a common starting point: the conviction that the crisis of the Muslim world was ultimately a religious crisis and the solution required a return to or radical reinterpretation of those Islamic principles, the divergence over what those principles meant and what they demanded in practice. Abu al-Maududi was one of the most systematically original political thinkers of Islam in the 20th century. Born in 1903 in British India, he watched the subcontinent's Muslim community navigate the complex politics of independence, partition, and the creation of Pakistan. He founded the Islami in 1941, and his writings, prolific, rigorous, and passionately argued, reached audiences across the entire Muslim world. Maududi's central claim was that Islam was not a religion of limited sense that the word carries in secular Western political discourse. It was not a set of private beliefs and ritual practice confined to the personal space while the public sphere was governed by secular law. Islam was, in his formulation, a complete ideology, a total system of thought and governance that addressed every dimension of human life: private, public, individual, collective, spiritual, and political. For this claim, implication of this claim was radical. If Islam is a complete ideology, competing with other complete ideologies, secular nationalism, capitalism, communism, then jihad was not merely a defensive measure. It was a vehicle by which this ideology advances, by which the unjust ordering of human society is transformed into the just one governed by divine sovereignty, what Maududi called Hakimiyya, the exclusive sovereignty of God. Now, he was careful to specify that his transformative jihad had to be organized, disciplined, and conducted by proper methods. He wasn't advocating terrorism. He envisioned a phase process. First, the building of a movement, then working through political means where possible, and resorting to force only when other avenues were blocked. His jihad was analogous in his own description, to a legitimate political revolution, not to random violence. But here's the problem. His framework, and the problem that applies equally to the man we are about to discuss: once you define jihad as a means of transforming the entire world, the logical question becomes, where does it stop? If the goal is to replace all governance by human-made law with governance of divine law, then potentially every non-Islamic political system is a legitimate target. The theoretical limitation is real, but the political constraint is elusive. Sayyid Qutb was an Egyptian literary critic who became the leading ideologist of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 1950s and 60s before being executed by Nasser's government in 1966. He read Maududi's and he was radicalized in Maududi's framework in ways that had profound consequences. Qutb's key contribution was his application of the concept of the ignorance of the pre-Islamic world to the contemporary situation. In classical Islamic thought, it was described that the state of the Arabian society before the Prophet's revelations, a world of polytheism, tribal violence, and moral disorder. Qutb argued that the modern world, including Muslim majority societies that were organized by secular law, was a new jahiliyyah, not ignorance of the existence of Islam, but something worse: willful rejection of God's sovereignty in favor of human-made systems of governments. This was a staggering claim. It meant that the rulers of Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Muslim rulers governing Muslim populations in Muslim countries, were in a state of apostasy to God's sovereignty if they continued by constitutions and legal codes rather than those by full imitation of Sharia. If they were in apostasy, the Muslim community was obligated to resist them, using force if necessary. His critics within the Islamic tradition said that there were many pointed out that this application to the Muslim majority countries broke with every precedent in classical tradition. No classical jurist had ever applied the concept to the rulers who professed Islam and prayed and fasted, however imperfectly they governed. The critics were right. The ideology of Qutb, articulated in his manifesto milestones, became the theoretical foundation of the Muslim that would murder Muslim heads of states, bomb mosques, and eventually attack civilians worldwide. Then this brings us to be clear that Mohadi and Qutb did not represent the only or even the dominant tendency of the 20th century of Islamic thinking of just war. They were just important precisely because they were influential. Now, Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt was founded by him in 1828, and he is in many ways a more complex figure than his organization's directory might suggest. He was, above all, an organizer and a preacher, someone whose primary concern was the moral and social renewal of Egyptian Muslim society, not political revolution or military jihad. Al-Banna's position on jihad was that it was an obligatory duty of every Muslim. He agreed with much of the activist tradition, but he immediately qualified this: jihad must not be a tool of oppression or aggression. It was, in his vision, comprehensive effort of encompassing education, social welfare, moral reform, and building to strong Islamic institutions. Military force was the last resort or principle. The Brotherhood under al-Banna built hospitals, schools, and social services along with its political organizations. He was assassinated in 1949, and the Brotherhood he founded that survived him evolved and splintered in many ways. But the model became institution building Islamism, committed to jihad in a principle, but primarily oriented towards social and moral transformation. It represents a different strain of development within Islamic thought. Muhammad Salhut offers perhaps the most theologically conservative and jurisprudently grounded modern restatement of Islamic just war principles. Shaltut, uh, as Sheikh of Al-Shazar from 58 to 63, Al-Azhar being the oldest and most prestigious university in the Islamic world, the institution that for centuries serves as the authoritative voice of Sunni legal scholarship, spoke from a position of institutional authority. Salhut's position was elegantly straightforward. The Quran permits warfare for three purposes and three purposes only. First, to repeal aggression against the Muslim community. Second, to protect the conditions in which the Islamic summons to faith can be heard and practiced freely. And third, to defend the religious freedoms of Muslims. That's it. The idea that Islam sanctions warfare for purpose of compelling non-Muslims to accept the faith was not part of it. So we have a spectrum of modern Islamic just war theory ideas. The slide maps the modern thinkers we have just discussed on a spectrum from the most restrictive to the most expansive, and I want to spend a moment on the visual because it captures something important that often gets lost in our discourse of Islam and war. Look at the left at the end of the spectrum. There's Shaltut, with his position that warfare is limited to repelling aggression and protecting religious freedom and preserving the conditions of Islamic summons of faith. This is a structural terms, a more restrictive view of just war than the United States' own military doctrine, which permits preemptive strikes based on anticipatory self-defense. Then al-Banna, who accepts a broader conception of obligatory jihad, but roots primarily in its institutional and social transformation rather than military action. Then we have Maududi, whose revolutionary ideology framework substantially expands the theological and theoretical scope of justified warfare through the important procedural constraints. Finally, Qutb, at the most expansive end, a framework that, in its theoretical structure, allows for warfare against virtually any non-Islamic political order. So, what does it tell us? Several things. Islam does not speak with one voice on the question. This is not a tradition of a single clear answer or a single authoritative institution that could prove one. It's a tradition with centuries of genuine different diversity of thought. Second, that the differences with these thinkers are not marginal. They are not minor variations. They represent fundamentally different visions within Islam. And third, the most important understanding of contemporary events, notice that all these thinkers, what they share, every single one of them accepts that war is sometimes necessary. So we have three reoccurring tensions. These three reoccurring tensions are over 1,200 years. These are not temporary disagreements that were eventually resolved. They are constructive, constitutive tensions, fundamental questions of the tradition has never been fully settled or perhaps cannot be fully settled. The first tension is between the offensive and defensive war. Is jihad a primarily an obligation to defend the Muslim community when it's attacked, a conservative reactive posture that kicks in only when others initiate violence, or is an obligation to advance the cause of Islamic governance, to bring the world into conformity and divine sovereignty? This tension cannot be resolved simply through reading the Quran more carefully, because as we saw, the Quran contains passages supporting both views. It cannot resolve simply by studying the Prophet's practice, because the Prophet's career included both phases A Meccan phrase of patience, endurance within the community was weak, and a Median phrase of active expansion in the community was strong. Second tension is between individual and collective obligations. When the Muslim community is threatened, who bears responsibility to respond? The classical tradition distinguished between collective obligations and its members being obligated to react. And third, when jihad the third tension is between demands of divine law and the constraints of political reality. Islamic just war theory, at its most principled, requires prior summons, proper authority, a just cause, and right intention, proportionality, and protection of non-combatants. In the real world of politics and war, these conditions are routinely impossible to fully satisfy. How should Muslim scholars then and communities respond to the inevitable gap between ideal law and imperfect practice? Well, the classical tradition developed sophisticated doctrines of necessity, darura, and the public interest, masala, to navigate the gap. Modern thinkers have navigated in different ways through international humanitarian law, others loosening standards to accommodate demands of revolutionary politics. Conclusions. Today, we have looked a lot over the history and modern thinking. So, what has it shown us? Islam does not speak with one voice of just war. The classical tradition of Islamic war thought was sophisticated, rule-bound, and respect strictly consistent with what we see in today and recognized as international humanitarian law. And that modern political Islam represents important ways a rupture with the classical tradition rather than the continuation of it within modern thought. And fourth, and finally, the understanding that tradition and its depth and complexity is not an academic exercise. It matters enormously for how we interpret it, how we engage in the world, nearly 2 billion Muslims, and how we think about the possibility of conversations across different civilizations. I thank you for tuning in.